Herbivory, predation, and parasitism are all plus-minus interactions. That is, one benefits and the other is harmed. They vary in how intimate and how lethal the interaction is. So, for example, herbivores, it's a relatively low lethality interaction because herbivores oftentimes browse on plants rather than eating the entire plant, so they can affect the plant's growth without killing it. And then it's a relatively low intimacy relationship in the sense that they just kind of walk by and browse on them rather than having a sort of a close relationship that is long term. Predators have a high lethality interaction. They usually kill they pretty much always kill their prey when they eat them. I think I'll go ahead and say always there. I always avoid the always and never terms, but I'll go ahead and say a predator always eats their prey when they've killed them. They don't always catch their prey, but once they do, they always eat them. And so that's a high lethality. But it's also not very intimate. So it's like possibly even a one-time interaction. Parasites, on the other hand, have a very high intimacy. They generally are living on an organism for a longer period of time. They tend to be low lethality, so it's in the parasite's best interest to just kind of take advantage of their host without killing it, because that gives them a longer lifespan because they're just kind of slowly sucking nutrients and etc. from the host. So predation is probably the most kind of iconic plus-minus interaction. So remember, in the case of predation, there's a predator and there's a prey. So the predator is the thing that's eating and the prey is the thing being eaten. Predation can have a very strong influence on prey populations, so it can have a very negative impact on prey populations. It's especially strong influence when the ecosystem is what's called predator controlled. So generally this means that resources are abundant. It can also have a particularly strong influence when the predator is a non-native invasive species. And so we'll look at some examples of this. So how much the predator affects prey densities depends on the kind of system that we're talking about. In a donor-controlled system, prey supply or population size is generally determined by stuff like food, like resources. So the rabbit population, for example, might be dependent on the amount of plant matter that there is for the rabbits to feed on, rather than on the number of predators. In a predator-controlled system, the action of the predator is actually what determines the population. So the rabbit population is not necessarily being affected by how much food there is for the rabbits, but rather on how many predators there are of the rabbits. Generally, it's believed that the majority of the systems appear to be predator controlled. So this is also suggesting that for the population, there's probably enough food resources for the prey, and so that they would continue to grow if it wasn't for the action of the predator. So one example of this is the Canada lynx and its prey in Canada. So they ended up having really good data on this population, and they found that the hare population, so the snowshoe hare, which is pictured here, its population would rise, and then the lynx population would also rise. And as the lynx population rose, it would drop down the snowshoe hare population. And actually, they found that this was actually a very predictable cyclical pattern. It took about 9 to 11 years for the hare population to rise, and then the lynx population to rise, and then for them to both drop down again in this kind of cyclical relationship, rather than just having flat, stable populations. And so this was demonstrating a predator-controlled system. Non-native invasive species also have a very strong predator effect on prey populations. And one of the most well-known examples of this is the brown tree snake. The brown tree snake was introduced to the island of Guam in the 1940s, probably by shipping. So a boat accidentally carried a brown tree snake from its native habitat in Australia to the island. On the island of Guam, there's no natural predators to the to the tree snake. Nobody eats the tree snake, in other words. And the animals that lived on Guam weren't used to having this predator around, and so they had no natural defenses against this tree snake. And so this had a really strong negative impact on prey populations in Guam, especially the birds. And so by the 1980s, so in less than 50 years, most of the island's forest birds were extinct because of the brown tree snake. So in many cases, these birds, they have their nests up in the tree, and they have no defenses for a snake that crawls up and eats their babies. And so, again, this can cause a very strong predator influence on prey population size, and in this case, to the point of extinction. Humans can also cause very large impacts on prey populations. Really, in essence, we operate as a non-native invasive species in many ecosystems. That is, there's no predators that go after us, and the prey have no evolved defenses against us. And so we oftentimes have this impact on our prey population, on organisms that are our prey, if you will, or that we impact or hunt. So how do prey balance out the effects of predators? So prey are not helpless, in other words. While they'll experience these impacts, they do have ways to reduce the impacts of predation. And there's a whole host of them that I'll go through here. So these are also sometimes called anti-predator strategies. One of them is chemical defense. So somehow having a chemical deterrent or a poison or something like that. So here's an example: a beetle that ejects a hot spray at something that tries to eat it. There are organisms that advertise that they are poisonous or taste bad. So this is a poison arrow frog that's advertising that it is poisonous with that beautiful blue color. Another strategy is cryptic coloration, which is another word for that is camouflage. So we see here this seahorse. You can just barely see its shape because it's blending in with its background. Another famous example are stick insects. They get their name because they look like a stick. And so if they're on a plant, it can be hard to see them. Many organisms use mimicry. So they might not be sort of poisonous or toxic themselves, but they try and mimic another organism that is. So one type of mimicry is when an organism that is not poisonous or bad tasting mimics one that is bad tasting or poisonous. A well-known example of this is the king snake. So the king snake here and the coral snake here. The coral snake is poisonous, and so predators are aware of that and recognize it, and so avoid it. The king snake is not poisonous, but notice how similar its patterning is. And so predators learn to avoid the king snake as well, as long as they know about the coral snake. Sorry for that. In another case called Mullerian mimicry, many different species sort of converge on a similar appearance in order to reinforce the warning. So the best known example of this is the black and yellow stripes of bees and wasps. So many bees and wasps do not sting, or they do not have stingers that are harmful to us, but they take on this coloration to just reinforce this warning. And so if you get stung by one, you're afraid of all the other species, is kind of how this works. In many cases, prey can actually do things that physically intimidate a predator. So for example, they can inflate their size. So this is a porcupine fish that's bloating itself up to look really hard to go after. And so, a predator might be like, oh, never mind, once it does that. So it's somehow trying to tell the predator, I am much harder to eat than you think I am. Maybe you have heard this advice for mountain lions. Like if you see a mountain lion and when you're hiking and it seems to be interested in you, You're supposed to hold up your bags or your arms and try and look as big as possible, because the bigger you look, the scarier you look, the less likely that mountain lion is to think that you're prey. Prey can also fight back. So, for example, deer and elk have horns, in the case of deer and elk, they have antlers, but prey can have horns, they can have antlers. These can actually be used to intimidate and fight against a predator. So if you watch any footage of Yellowstone wolves, you will see elk, for example, put down their head, face their antlers towards the wolf, and try and hit the wolf with their antlers. And that can be very effective to keep the wolf away from you, if you're an elk. Agility, running away and jumping away. So lots of organisms can run and jump. This is a really simple strategy. So like I was mentioning the elk and wolf example, elk can run away from the wolves. They can't necessarily, they can try and get to a place where the wolf can't get them. So I've watched footage, for example, of an elk run into water and then the wolf can't get it. So they can't necessarily always outrun a wolf, but if they can get to a place where they can no longer be gotten at by the wolf, they're good. They can jump up their back legs and kick. I didn't mention this, but that's another way they can fight. So prey don't always go down easily. They have a will to live as well. And so they will fight and they will run. Some organisms have evolved armor, so think of like the shells of a turtle, which make it really hard for a lot of things to eat it. Beetles have a hard exoskeleton, which can make them unpalatable or harder to feed on. So lots of things have some kind of coating, harder coating that can protect them. A sort of less obvious one, it's almost sacrificial, is kind of how I think of it, is masting. This is where organisms produce large amounts of offspring all at the same time, with sort of like to sacrifice some of their offspring to the predators. So if you have so many offspring, your predators will eat most of them, but you're likely that some will survive. And so you see this with a lot of plants, where they will make all of their seeds all at one time. And so, yeah, a bunch of their seeds are going to get eaten, but they made so many that odds are some will survive. Cicadas are another well-known example of this. Cicadas are the insect that you sometimes hear, like in the summertime, you'll hear them making the really, really loud buzzing noise in the trees. And there's like 7-year cicadas and 12-year cicadas. That year designation is about their masting cycle. So they will produce all of their offspring on like the 7-year cycle, for example, because so many of their offspring get eaten. But again, if they produce a lot of them, then some will survive.